Okay. Cool. I'll edit out the beginning and anything that we don't want in there. But okay, so welcome to the first of our kind of informal podcasty style chats with New York School people. Our inaugural event. Our first guest is Andrew Epstein. Andrew, what drew you to New York School writing first place? You've obviously been doing this for a long time and thinking a lot about these poets, and I just wondered, how did you find yourself kind of into this and writing about it?
For me, it's a fairly long story, so I'm going to kind of go back to the beginning. But and first of all, just thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here to talk with you guys about this stuff, and I always love talking about this stuff. So yeah, for me, it goes back a long way. I was first introduced to Frank OHara's work in a class, a really formative class on post-World War II poetry that I took at during college at Bryn Mawr College. I went to Haverford College outside Philadelphia, and it was affiliated with Bryn Mawr College, and I took a lot of classes there, and it was a really great class, and I fell in love with OHara's work pretty quickly for all the usual reasons people fall for OHara. I just immediately found it super refreshing and funny and beautiful and weird and unlike anything I'd read before. And later that same year, I think I was I spent the summer in Berkeley, California, and I went to like the sacred hallowed ground of City Lights Books, and instead of buying Ginsberg, I stumbled on Lunch Poems, and I had liked OHara enough in that class that I bought a copy of Lunch Poems. This is the summer of 1990, and I was really excited about it. And but I went back to college, and I ended up doing a senior thesis on a really different poet, on James Wright and the Deep Image School, and I think my tastes were a little bit more sort of middle of the road lyric poetry at that point, and I kept being interested in OHara, but when I got to grad school, I went to Columbia University and took a couple of classes where I studied OHara. I studied Ashbery, which really finally clicked for me. I had seen Ashbery read actually at Bryn Mawr from Flowchart, and I didn't really understand a word of it, and I just thought, this is gorgeous, but I don't understand it, and it's intimidating. But Ashbery kind of clicked for me in the grad class my first year. But the really sort of pivotal thing for me, which was kind of life-changing, was that in my second year of grad school, I had a remarkable stroke of good luck, which is that I had the chance to meet Kenneth Koch, and he was a professor at Columbia, and he didn't teach grad students, he only taught undergrads. And every year he had somebody appointed to be his research and teaching assistant. And I got a phone call. I actually remember I was sitting on the fire escape of my apartment in Greenwich Village, and I got a phone call. I was reading the Norton Anthology of Contemporary, Norton Anthology of Modern Poetry. And it was sitting next to me, and I got a phone call saying, we have an opening. Would you like to be Kenneth Cook's assistant for this upcoming year? And I was like, oh my God, sure, yeah, because they knew that I was interested in poetry, and so they kind of matched people with him. And I flipped open the book, and I was like, he's in the book I'm sitting next to. This was like really kind of mind-blowing for me and very intimidating also. And so I went and I became his assistant in my second year of grad school, and it was both grading his papers and attending his lectures, but also just being his kind of all-around gopher and assistant, which was really just eye-opening and cool and a wild experience for me. And I was this, nervous 23-year-old, 24-year-old, super interested in poetry. And suddenly I'm sitting across from this really famous, maybe 68-year-old or whatever he was at that point, who is, pretty fully canonized by then, and trying to figure out how to do his bidding. And so he asked me to do a whole bunch of stuff, like fetch stuff for him from a store, make phone calls, help him plan his wedding, which was about to happen at that point. And also one of my first tasks was he handed me this folder of postcards and really thin, typing paper letters, a whole, maybe 100 of letters from John Ashbery to him from the 50s and 60s, especially. Wow. And he said, go next door and Xerox those in the office next door. And I said, okay, what is it? And he said, it's letters from John Ashbery. He said, David Lehman is writing this book on the New York School, which became The Last Avant-Garde. This was about 1994. And he said, David wants copies of these letters, which are not published and they're not in any archives. They're just in my apartment. This is before Cook donated his papers to the Berg collection at the New York Public Library. So they were just sitting in his apartment, and he had me Xerox them. And I think I was supposed to do it, that hour or whatever, but it took me a lot longer because I just got obsessively interested in reading these fascinating letters. And I thought this is like a incredible gold mine that nobody's ever seen before. And so I read these letters, which were an incredible look into the Koch-Ashbery friendship and all of the gossip and the aesthetic preoccupations of their group. And that was just the beginning. And so I spent the next, that whole year working as his assistant, but really the next 6 or 7 years being very close with Koch and helping him with a lot of different things. And it gave me this kind of, really just indispensable firsthand window onto his world and the poets that he knew and loved. And he talked about OHara and Ashbery, who he called my greatest living rival in one of our first meetings. He called Ashbery that. He talked about them all the time. And it was, and the whole circle of New York School poets, and he made them seem, as he did in the classroom as well, like the most important and greatest writers that had ever lived. And so it was sort of infectious, and he also very generously invited me to book parties and events and readings, and really kind of gave me this introduction to a whole world. It was really an education in itself. And I also helped him run a reading series at Columbia that became something that I did for the next 5 years. And that was a really great experience, although a lot of what I did was like putting ads in the Village Voice and setting up chairs and getting tea and cookies and things like that. But I also, the perk was that he would invite me and anyone else who helped out, but to like a reading, to a dinner afterwards. So I usually got to meet the readers and then also go to like a smaller event. And this was just, all of his friends that he decided to bring to Columbia in the 90s, people like Ashbery and Ron Padgett and David Shapiro and Lorenzo Thomas and Alice Notley and Bill Berkson, John Yao, but also poets from like sort of other movements. Like I guess the biggest were probably Gary Snyder and Robert Creeley and Allen Ginsberg and also Lynn Hajuni and Ron Silliman. So I got to be involved in that. And that was also really amazing, and went to like a dinner that I'll never forget at his house with Robert Creeley and Kenneth Cook.
God.
and the painter Alex Katz, which was probably the coolest dinner I've ever been to in my life. And I was very starry-eyed. And also during that period, the poetry project at St. Mark's became sort of a home away from home for me. I went to readings there pretty constantly, probably once every week or two, and got to know a lot of the current practitioners that kind of affiliated themselves with the New York School, and became friendly with younger poets that are affiliated with the New York School, like Jordan Davis and Anselm Berrigan and other people that were kind of in and around that scene, and also younger scholars that have gone on to be really great prominent scholars like Daniel Kane and Libby Rifkin and Lytle Shaw. Like we were all kind of working on similar material at the same time, and I think we all felt like we were part of, had some kind of shared purpose in working on this stuff. So all in all, like my life in the 1990s in New York, hanging around Kenneth Cook, hanging around the Poetry Project, was a real education in all things New York School. And then the last thing I would say is just from sort of an academic side of things or scholarly side of things, this set of interests culminated for me when I decided to write my dissertation on friendship and community in the New York School scene, with a special focus on OHara and Ashbery. At the time, Kenneth said, "Why aren't you writing about me?" Why not? But it was a little uncomfortable to write about somebody that closely connected to, and I ended up writing a lot about Kenneth as well, but it was about OHara and Ashbery and Amiri Baraka and their larger circle. And a lot of it had to do with, a lot of the genesis had to do with hearing Koch talk so much about friendship and rivalry and competition, and how much his friendships with those poets drove his work and inspired him, but how complicated those friendships were and how they weren't simply peace and love and happiness, but also a kind of competitive rivalry. So that turned into my first book a few years down the road, which was Beautiful Enemies. So that's sort of my origin story for New York School interests.
I mean, there's a lot there, Andrew. There's a lot there. First of all, deeply jealous of your time in the 90s. I think on behalf of anybody listening, what a gig. And I don't know how
I got really lucky, and, and I got.
Am I remembering that Jordan Davis also had that job?
Yeah, Jordan had graduated from Columbia and had been a student of Kenneth's, and he continued working really closely with him, almost as a kind of not secretary, but like he helped him. And he was doing that at the same time that I was doing my job, and then but I was doing it as part of my uni. Yeah, and then I rotated out, and other people rotated in, but Jordan kept working with Kenneth all through those years in the 90s.
Yeah, I mean, I want to
a lot of help, put it that way. Kenneth.
Yeah, like the most. I think anybody would want to like the gossip bits or the fun bits, but there's also some theoretical stuff here to unpack. On the gossipy side, you must have learned so much about not just Kenneth Koch, the writer, but the human being. And I find it really hard to access that human being as someone who never met him, but who loves his poetry, partly because of the kind of skin on it in humor, what people call humor, perhaps too easily or readily call humor. It's like, it's a sort of persona that stops you from, comprehending the possible like multi layers of the person behind the poem.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Was he that funny in person?
He was very funny in person, and very charismatic and very brilliant and very quick-witted. My experience was that although we got to be close, I always felt intimidated for lots of reasons, and also just like a little flat-footed. Like he would, suddenly speak in Italian and then make a reference to Valerie or whatever, and I'd be like, I just always felt like I wasn't quite witty enough, quite worldly enough, But and so being with him was sometimes challenging. He also didn't suffer fools gladly. He, maybe you can see some of this in the work. There's a kind of I don't know, prickliness is not the right word, but cutting quality to him, and cutting humor, and so he didn't have a lot of patience for stuff that he thought was silly, or he would kind of cut you down, tease you a little bit, So he was complicated. He was, especially as a young mentee or whatever, it was a complicated relationship, and also, like I said, he was a little bit jealous of the attention I was giving to his more famous friends. I think he had a lot of insecurity about his role in the group and narratives of the group and his own canonization. I remember sitting in his office one day when he got a phone call. This was back in the days, when your phone would ring and you pick it up and not know who.
Imagine.
And it was somebody, an editor or somebody a publisher who was putting together an anthology of light verse, and asked him if they could publish the variations on a theme by William Carlos Williams, his parody of This Is Just to Say. And he got off the phone. He was very mad. And he said, I'm so sick of people, first of all, why then just that poem, and then, light verse, and, that kind of thing. So he was, and he was impatient with the idea that everybody would always preface everything by saying, he's very funny, but he's not only funny, And the other thing I was going to say, go ahead, Yasmine.
Well, I mean, we're on a Koch tangent for a second, but I wonder if that's one of the reasons, I've wondered this for a while, that there is so little scholarship on Koch alone. He's mentioned often, like in a paragraph regarding other poets, but it's almost like, there's a slipperiness there that criticism still doesn't know exactly what to do with in a sustained way.
Yeah, I think that's true. And there are, a handful of good scholarly pieces, but not a lot. There is a biography in the works, which I'm really about. So I think that'll change the discussion some. And what I was going to say also was, I have to say also, despite the other things I was saying, he was also very generous, and especially if he felt like, he was somebody that he took an interest in, which I was, for whatever reason, I was somebody that he did. But he, like I said, welcomed me to come into his life and come to events. And he introduced me. At that point, I was also a creative writer and I wrote poetry. But he introduced me to like Allen Ginsberg and said, "This is Andrew. He's a young poet." And I was like, I can't believe that this person said to that person that I'm a poet. You know, it was, I think, the first person who ever said that about me. And he also was encouraging about my scholarly work too, although he didn't love lit crit and theory and things like that. But anyway, it was a really remarkable relationship. And I think anybody who knew him in person, I think, would say that he was witty, funny, charismatic, and all the things you see on the page, as well as, and I think you can see this from the letters and some other things that have been published, that he was also a difficult person in some ways, you know, like,
yeah,
you know, competitive and all, you know, everybody's human, you know. And he was
what's your favorite Koch poem? Oh
gosh, I don't even know. I mean, there's so many different periods of Koch that I love, and I like teaching Koch and I like writing about Koch. I guess I'm just going to say The Circus, the second poem that reflects on the first poem, The Circus, which is always very moving and heartbreaking for me. And but there's 20 others that I could mention that I love.
Can I ask one more theoretical question before we move on? Just about your work and how it started with that notion of, you know, taking friendship as a lens, because you mentioned Lytle Shaw, and of course he's also written about, well, and also so has Kane, for that matter, in a way, about coterie, but you all do it through such different angles. And something that I think Rona and I share in appreciating your angle among the others as well is, well, that it's generative, you know, it's very human, and it's the kind of book that Beautiful Enemies, for example, and Attention Equals Life are the kinds of books that I could recommend to people that don't know the New York School, you know, to get them into it, because there are certain sentences in there that translate out of the school and into life at large so readily. Do you guys ever talk about those overlapping as scholars?
Definitely. I mean, I think at some point in the late 90s, I met Lytle and discovered we were both writing about very similar. Right. It was also his dissertation, I think, at Berkeley, was Frank OHara and coterie. And this happened with also a scholar named Michael McGee, who was writing about pragmatism and OHara and Baraka, and he became a good friend of mine. And this is something that happens to a lot of people when they're working on dissertations, that you find these other people out there in the wilderness who are doing similar stuff, and it's makes you feel a little nervous and maybe territorial, but less than that. I think it was energizing and exciting. Like, I think it was cool to feel like we were part of a turn. I think some people have called it like a social turn or turn to friendship in discussions of poetry and post-war poetry in general, and the New York School in particular. And so, you know, Daniel, who was a good friend of mine, started writing about the poetics of sociability, and especially the second generation New York School. And I would say it was sort of, we were feeding off each other in a generative way. And from my, you know, perspective, I don't know, it was a bunch of different things came together, but like, I found the model that was sort of floating around in the early 90s about influence, which was still a kind of lingering Bloomian, Carl Bloom kind of vertical, agonistic anxiety of influence model, very limiting, and it didn't fit the poets that I was suddenly immersed in and loving. And so I wanted to think horizontally about poets who are peers, and I wanted to think about relationships that weren't only antagonistic, but were also cooperative and collaborative. You know, the whole collaborative ethos of New York School just didn't fit with the other models of influence. And so, and I also, like I said, became really fascinated with this mingling of kind of rivalry and affection that is, again, to use the same word, but generative. Like, it was provocative. And I found models for that going back to Emerson's ideas about friendship, that we don't just agree with our friends, we find that they provoke us to new thoughts and new greater and greater heights, and that there's an element of dissensus in productive friendships, and also not necessarily only a good thing, it's also a burden. And that OHara, for example, who is hailed as the great bard of friendship, is also a poet who writes a lot about the discontents and burdens and anxieties of friendship. So I wanted to look at it in a less, first of all, to look at groups, but not only look at groups as things to celebrate, sort of like anecdotally, like it was so much fun and we were all friends, and which was a lot of what was in the air in the 90s. If somebody was talking about movements and communities, it was a little bit more on that side. And I was part of a group of scholars that started to look at the interplay and tensions and complexities of those relationships.
That's great. I saw this great acknowledgement today for I.A. Richards, who is the source of all ideas in this book, even the minor ones arrived at by disagreeing with him.
Yeah, that's
a mini love letter.
Yeah. Mm. I'm really struck by the way that it's almost like a kind of coterie of critics and scholars forming around this particular way of thinking about poetry.
Yeah. I should also mention Libby Rifkin too, who was writing about Creeley and Olson and Berrigan and careers, and she became a good friend at around the same time too. So it was like, not that we were all in the same place or drinking in the same bars, but there was a sense of collective purpose, like you're saying. Yeah.
And it's a great model for scholarship, which I think, as you said, can feel isolating and combative, but it really doesn't need to. Even if you do meet someone who's actually working on a really similar topic, like why not be friends? And I think we find a lot of that in your work, that idea that friendship is generative. It reminds me of some of the things that Brian Glavy's been writing about recently to do with relatability and sharing. Mm-hmm. And that idea that we get something out of aesthetic experiences by telling other people about them. And I wondered, like, is this the kind of thing that keeps you working on the New York School? Is like, what is it that keeps you here in this in this field?
Yeah, I guess that is part of it, and getting to see what friends like Brian Glavy are working on, and then seeing how our ideas kind of bounce off each other and stuff like that is definitely something that keeps me interested. I think, why do I keep writing and thinking about the New York School and teaching it? I think I guess the writing, first and foremost, the poetry, has just never stopped being really fascinating to me and really energizing. From the very beginning, I was kind of blown away by the writing above all else. And I love their work for a lot of the same reasons everybody else loves their work, but the things like the linguistic energy of the work, the idea of poetry as play or pleasure, the humor and fun of it, just kind of the sheer fun. But not only that, the interest in the absurd and the surreal, the fascination with the quotidian, which was really important to me and led into the second book that I wrote, that they seem to not just write about dailiness, but to think about it as a theme and even a philosophical problem, which I've continued to find really interesting. And I guess throughout this, the New York School as a whole, to speak really broadly about a very large set of poets and movement, aesthetics, but the mix of kind of high spirits and fun with philosophical seriousness and depth, and things like melancholy and a sense of transience and mortality. That thing, I think, David Lehman says that someplace that OHara's work is, his characteristic tone is 2/5 joy, 3/5 melancholy, but I might have the ratio off. But that kind of mix has always drawn me to them, and also the way that they deal with subjectivity and selfhood and the complexity and changingness and protean qualities of the self. So running through it, I think I've been drawn to not just the linguistic energy or the verbal fun of the poetry, but also the philosophical outlook that kind of just chimed with me from an early stage. And maybe this is just me, but the kind of anti-foundational, skeptical, what I call pragmatist, general outlook, or I think, I can't remember if I say this or somebody else says this, but the kind of affirmative skepticism in OHara, which I might have quoted from somebody, or I might say that, I can't remember, but the affirmative skepticism maybe it's just my own temperament, but that mix has kept me interested in the New York School. And then just a couple other things. I think just the fact that I think even more so than other bodies of post-war American poetry or poetry in general, it allows you entrance to so many other interesting areas because of their wide-ranging interests, because of how much they incorporate into their work. But somebody who's very interested in visual art and in music and in movies, their work just opens on to all of these different areas, which I mean, I think it's great to just study poetry as poetry, but it also has always been this kind of, I don't know, like sort of treasure trove of connections to other interesting art forms and cultural contexts. So, and then the fact that they kind of built and wrote themselves into their own canon, I kind of also fell for their canon, which is still important to me, sort of the avant-garde, the modernists that they drew on, Stein and Williams and Apollinaire and Mayakovsky, Lorca, that kind of thing. So those are all reasons why I got interested in the first place and have stayed interested.
And they're also good. Also very good reasons to stay.
Yeah. I was just a quick follow-up. You had mentioned James Wright in the first response, and now you're talking about the ways in which these poets are kind of wide-ranging fields unto themselves, and Wright and the sort of deep imagist movement. And I recently came to be aware of the fact that John Cody was around, John Ashbery, and at one point considered himself to be, affiliated with the New York School, and by extent, and other poets that we don't necessarily think of so readily, like Charles North, for example, and I wonder if the friendships that those poets forged allow your work to continue to multiply. Like on your blog, sometimes, you'll have a feature on somebody that people might not recognize as New York School and say, well, here's a correspondence, or here's a citation. So if that friendship became a field too, that
yeah, I think that makes sense and is true for my interests. And I think there's the sort of main five of the original first generation, which is interesting enough, but there's so many other poets that radiate out in so many directions, including obviously the second generation. But then there's all these sort of tangential figures. And I'm thinking from your comment that there was a thing about James Merrill that I wrote about.
That's the one I was thinking of, actually.
So many other figures that intersect one way or another. And maybe that would be true if you were obsessive as I am on James Wright and his circle, but I feel like it's more so here. And it might be because of that, just the collaborative and friendship focused sense of a scene and of networks and of affiliations and things like that. So, yeah.
Might also have a little bit to do with New York City itself.
Yeah.
As a sort of artistic center that people cross through.
So what are you working on at the moment?
So in terms of New York School related things, and in terms of at the exact moment, this kind of ties into what we were just saying, but Yasmine was asking about, but I'm writing a piece about the musician and poet David Berman, who died a couple of years ago. And he was for people who don't know, he was the founder and main creative force in a much loved indie band called Silver Jews that emerged in the 1990s in connection with the band Pavement and other indie music in the 90s. And Berman was also a poet, though, and he studied with Charles Wright and then with the James Tate New York School adjacent figure, James Tate, who was a really big influence on Berman's work. And he published a book of poems, Actual Air, in 1999, that's become really influential. And but he's better known as a musician and an indie rock guy, but he's famous for his lyrics and his incorporation of sort of poetic devices into rock music, I guess. And I argued before on my blog a few years ago when he passed away that he was deeply connected to the New York School in a lot of ways. And he cited Kenneth Koch as a major influence of his, and his work's been compared to Ashbery and OHara and the rest. So there's going to be a cluster of essays, kind of the first maybe collection of semi-scholarly work on Berman in the online venue Post 45. And I'm contributing something to that. And it's particularly going to be about Berman's interest or fascination with the aphorism or aphoristic statements in his writing, both in poetry and in music. Something that I think could be connected to like Kenneth Koch, and I'm thinking of pieces like Some General Instructions, which give sort of wise sayings that are also kind of don't totally fit what we expect them to be, and so on. So I'm writing about Berman, and then other New York School related stuff. I'm just recently finished a piece on Wallace Stevens for a new collection called The New Stevens Studies. And that has just come out from Cambridge, though I haven't seen it yet. But the piece is about kind of a little hobby horse of mine about Wallace Stevens, who's also one of my first loves as a poet. You know, somebody that I've been thinking about and writing about since the beginning of my career. And the piece argues that the New York School poets, and not just Ashbery, who's often considered an heir to Stevens, especially by like Harold Bloom. But the New York School poets in general are deeply influenced and inspired by Stevens in some complicated ways. And that I also try to make the case that this influence has been overlooked. It's been downplayed by narratives of 20th century poetry. He's sort of thought of as like sort of in the other camp, but he is such a big influence on all of them, and like, including OHara, who's often thought of as sort of like dissing Stevens and turning away from that. And I think whatever Stevens represents, and I argue that he's much more sort of ambivalently fascinated by Stevens. And so I think that like that's sort of a misreading of Stevens that has made him seem a little more traditional than he actually is. He's an avant-garde poet, and he influences everything from the New York School to language poetry. And also it limits how we think of the New York School, because it kind of takes away some of the philosophical depth and complexity of the New York School. They're just supposed to be chatty and talking about trivial things, but they're actually very immersed in the kind of philosophical issues that Stevens raises. So that piece has just come out. And then I'm also working on a piece on Robert Lowell, of all people, and his relationship to the new American poetry for a collection called Lowell in Context. So it's kind of about the raw versus cooked famous dichotomy that Lowell established, but looking a little more deeply at what his relationship was to the raw side of the divide that he identified. And particularly the New York School will be a part of that. And there's, you know, the famous stories about OHara and Lowell, which will be a part of it too, about reading the Lana Turner poem at the reading that he gave with Lowell, and Lowell being annoyed and that kind of stuff. So I'm still working on that. And then the biggest project is my next book, which is hopefully getting close to being done, which is a broader study of it's a Cambridge Introduction to American Poetry since 1945. So it's not just about the New York School, but there's a big important chapter about the New York School and its importance and influence.
That's so great. Again, so much there. I'd like to think that I've got good taste, because I also am obsessed with Wallace Stevens in a way that, you know, has just been sitting there for a long time.
Yeah.
And
Me too.
you are too, Rona. I didn't know that.
Same.
Yeah. I dream of.
And I really see that connection. I think
I'm
so excited to read this, because I feel that connection when I read OHara, especially. It's like there's a direct line there to what
I think it's that 3/5 melancholy.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like the poets, when you speak to them, they love to grab onto Williams. And I think in doing so, it would feel like, you know, a betrayal to say, no, actually it's Stevens, you know, or some sort of undermining.
So I talked about this way back when in Beautiful Enemies, but there's this letter from OHara to Ashbery early on where he says, Ashbery to OHara, and he says, by some strange but no doubt explainable coincidence, I've been reading lots of Stevens while you've been on your Williams kick. And so I argued there that they kind of set themselves up intentionally as part of their complicated friendship dynamic, is like, I'm Stevens to your Williams, but which I think there's something definitely there. And obviously OHara and his plain-spokenness and his interest in the everyday and all that stuff is clearly coming out of Williams, but there's also this very important Stevens part. And I think that they both draw from Stevens a lot, and maybe OHara kind of defensively pulls away a little bit. I argue because he's trying to kind of get away from what Ashbery's up to a little bit, but it's still there in this residual way. And then there's poets like Schuyler, who I think is very Stevensian in his concerns with reality and the imagination and all the other issues that Schuyler deals with. And Berrigan loved Stevens, and he's sort of everywhere but kind of nowhere, so
on his obsession with the local, Stevens's obsession, totally. you can see that at play, in Ashbery with atmosphere and
right,
more abstract versions of environment, but with others places and spaces. And
people like to think Stevens is sort of abstract and only about consciousness, but another hobby horse of mine is that Stevens is obsessed with dailiness in the everyday, and I've written about that elsewhere, but that's part of what I think connects him to the New York School, just like you said.
Oh, very much looking forward to those publications.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, that's an awful lot. And I'm interested in how you fit your incredible blog, all of that. And I'm so I was thinking about the things that I've discovered there about music, cooking, and weather, and it just, and like fashion. And how do you find these things? Are you on the lookout? Constantly, do they sort of come to you? Do they like bubble up from the wider culture, or how do you find them?
I guess the story of the blog is that back in like 2013, I decided to do something kind of weird with my enthusiasm about the New York School, which is to try to I kept noticing how frequently things were popping up in the culture, and that I wanted someplace to kind of notice them and list them and talk about them. And so I started a blog kind of after the heyday of blogs. I kind of missed the moment, but I started just a website to put stuff up there, and it became really fun, and there seemed to be sort of an audience for it. And I started to see things constantly, like kind of that thing where the more you look for something, the more you start to see it everywhere. But I started doing searches and just keeping my eyes out in general, just sort of general attentiveness to poetry news and things like that. But also people started sending me things that were of interest, so and I invited that, and so that helped. But I started posting things about sightings of these poets and trends and developments and weird crossovers and things that I read and stuff like that. So it was a lot of fun. I put a lot of time and energy into it, and posted a lot, especially in the beginning, like sometimes a couple times a week, and it kind of took off, and it was a lot of fun. But it was always sort of in competition with my quote unquote real work, because it doesn't really count. My university doesn't count it.
Yeah.
There are hundreds and hundreds of posts that, aren't real scholarship, but they seemed valuable to me and to other people. It seems to have been useful, I hope. And the way that I think I kind of kept up with stuff or find new things, just kind of keeping your eyes out was very helpful, and looking at places where they might pop up, scholarly journals and literary magazines and poetry blogs and social media and stuff like that. But I think a very good practical thing, if you're interested in doing something like this, was setting up Google alerts. Maybe you already know this, but Google alerts for the poets or key terms, where you can get, I think anytime something pops up new on Google, or you can get like a digest maybe once a week, I forget. I just get it kind of sent to me. And so a lot of it is, the bulk of it is junk, but you will find, there's a new piece in Vogue.
I cannot imagine how much you're getting on Brainard right now.
Yeah.
So stuff like that, right? Brainard in fashion, and so that's been really helpful. And I would say that it's sort of like more, you would be surprised at how much there is. And I got a little bit burned out from trying to keep up, because there's that much, just sort of daily news and sightings. And I needed to buckle down and work on my book and stuff like that. So I've been on a little bit of a hiatus recently, but I hope to go back to it. I don't know if I'll be able to go back to the original pace, but just generally, there's a lot of activity out there and a lot of interest, and new books, new scholarly articles, and just weird sightings of like Jennifer Lawrence carrying a lunch poems handbag or whatever, right?
Yeah. That one was just my favorite.
It's a whole new chapter.
Everyone's saying, hey, that copy of Lunch Poems is so big.
Right. And it was like I don't forget how much, like $5,000 purse or something.
Yeah.
A very expensive purse.
I'm so sad about the Joe Brainard fashion stuff, like how much that, you know, pansy purse would mean to me. The irony of all of us out there.
People who it would really matter.
Exactly.
Inaccessible. I know.
I guess we'll be thrift shopping it for a decade to come, hoping something like that turns up.
And what about like scholarly work? So that's obviously something that pops up on the blog, and I just wondered, have you been reading anything lately that you would recommend to kind of fellow New York School enthusiasts, or any kind of articles or books that have particularly stood out to you recently?
Yeah. I guess one I would make a plug for of being of interest to your viewers would be, if people haven't seen it yet, Benjamin Lee has a new book called Poetics of Emergence from Iowa within the last year or so, which is a really interesting and timely book about poetry and politics, and particularly coming from the direction of affect theory and sort of charting how post-war American poetry, especially avant-garde poetry, reacts to and writes about history sort of as how it feels as it's emerging, you know, as it's unfolding on a kind of lived basis. And he has really good chapters on Ginsberg, Baraka, OHara, and Diane DePrima. So I would recommend that, and I've used it in with my classes, and they seem to like it, and it generates some interesting discussion. What else? There was a recent cluster of essays on Bernadette Mayer at Post 45, online cluster of essays, and it was fun to see and exciting to see that kind of attention. They're not full-fledged scholarly articles, but sort of, you know, public facing, I guess you'd call them. And there's still a few that I need to go back to, but I enjoyed reading those. I was also going to mention a piece that came out also in Post 45 a little while back by Joshua Coten. That was a really interesting piece for New York School fans about Kenneth Koch. I don't know if you guys saw this piece, but it was about a postcard that Koch.
Yes, I did see it. That was fascinating.
Really fascinating, from Amiri Baraka, or he seemed to have received it from Amiri Baraka in about, I guess, 1965, and or 64, I can't remember the date. And Josh Coten writes this piece about how hard it is to interpret the tone and meaning of this postcard that he came across in an archive that seems to be very hostile and raises issues of race, and is directed to Koch, and it was dated April 1st, and it seems like it could be an April Fool's joke, or it could be an actually kind of aggressive move by Baraka, who at that moment was moving away from his connections to the New York School to Black nationalism and the Black arts movement. And then there was sort of an interesting, I talked to Josh a little bit while he was writing it, and sort of gave my 2 cents about what I thought was going on with it. And I thought it was really interesting, and he wrote a really interesting piece about it. But then there was a postscript that the New York School scholar and poet Nick Sturm read it and said, I think this is actually a playful hoax by Ted Berrigan. He wrote the postcard, not Baraka. And it sort of just further exemplified how hard it is to interpret this document. It was part of a cluster of essays about interpretation and interpretive difficulty. But if you haven't read it yet, it's a really interesting piece at Post 45 by Joshua Coten.
I can't wait to read that. I have to ask the hard question about race in this minute, because it is interesting that whenever the topic comes up, it's really hard to deal with head on in the New York School. You've got 2 sort of key African-American poets, Amiri Baraka and Lorenzo Thomas, who both arguably left the school for political reasons, you know, and did so in a slightly, you know, forceful way. And it's, I mean, I'm just recalling, Rona, when we had that talk at our symposium on Joe Brainard's Nancy in blackface, and how just no one wanted to talk about it. So Nick's Nick's counter thought, although playful and in the spirit of Berrigan himself and other, kinds of jokes of the New York school, also demonstrates this resistance to that discussion.
Yeah, definitely. And it's problematic and complicated in the ways that you're suggesting. And and as you know, I have given a lot of thought to Baraka in relationship to OHara and to the downtown bohemian scene that he was a part of, and his departure from it, and his way of writing his way through it, and also their reaction to it. OHara's was very hurt and felt abandoned, but also had complicated 1960s views about race and stuff too. So it does need to be addressed more. I think there's been some good work in that direction, particularly OHara and race, but there's definitely a lot more there.
And Josh Coating's kind of reflections on the implications of what Nick suggests is fascinating, I think, in relation to that, both in terms of how scholarship kind of enacts or reflects on some of these questions, but also in terms of what maybe happened or didn't happen between OHara, Berrigan, Koch, Berrigan, and Baraka.
Right. And he sort of takes it head on, I guess. If I remember.
Takes it head on, and it's very, again, as you said, it's part of this kind of series of essays on interpretations, and so he's then sort of interpreting his interpretation as well as Nick's interpret. It's just it's a really wonderful piece. As other things you've recommended,
I still can't figure out if I'm going to use this word because I feel like we're doing it, you and I, Rona, even here, the mimicry of the scholarship to the poetry, so the act of Nick giving that sort of back and forth option, or the act of you, Andrew, and Daniel, and Libby, and Lytle, hanging out and being like a sort of a micro version of the very thing that you're admiring and studying, is one of the New York School's most wonderful spin-offs. Is that there is this sort of scholarship that seeks to emulate some of its most fascinating aspects.
Can I
Yeah, please tell me.
I was going to give a plug that'll embarrass you guys, but that's why I'm so excited about this network, which is really doing exactly what you're saying. So it's just the way it's being conceived of, also not just as an association of so and so studies, but really emphasizing the network interconnections and bonds of friendship and dialogue and collaboration. So I'm really glad that that's how this is coming to whatever.
Very glad it reads that way, as opposed to derivative.
Just a final question, Andrew. I'm interested, you mentioned teaching Koch, and I just wondered how New York School writing fits in with your teaching, and what your students make of it. Are they, you said at the start that coming to this writing as a young scholar, you found it kind of refreshing and funny and beautiful and weird. Is that something that you're noticing happens with your students as well?
I do think so. I mean, I'm coming off a week of teaching, or a week and a half of teaching OHara, and as usual, students seem to really enjoy it and find it refreshing and funny and beautiful and weird and intimate. And they sometimes end up calling him Frank. I'm sure you've experienced this on your tests and papers, that there's this strange intimacy that they feel with his work. And I do feel like for a lot of them, it's sort of I've never seen poetry that looks like this before. Oh God, it's so wonderful to, drink so much coffee and smoke so many cigarettes and love you so much. And I didn't know you could write a poem like that, and so I teach all of these poets a lot and regularly, in courses on contemporary poetry. I'll do a bunch on OHara and Koch and Ashbery courses. They've ended up in courses on post-war American culture of the 1950s and 60s, a course on women's poetry, a whole bunch of other ways. Probably the most sustained way I've taught them is a seminar that I've taught off and on, every couple of years for many years on the New York School as a movement and a group, as a graduate seminar, which has always been a lot of fun. It's usually a mix of poets, and because of the way my program is structured, but a mix of poets and scholars. And that's always been a lot of fun. It's really hard to fit everything into one semester, even a whole semester just on the New York School, which sort of led me last year to teaching my first ever single author class. In all my decades of teaching, I taught a Frank OHara grad seminar, which still incorporated lots of the other figures, but they were more kind of marginal to using OHara as the focal point. And he's a figure that really lends himself well to kind of deep dive because of the things we've talked about, how much his work radiates out in so many different directions and how fascinating he is culturally, politically, aesthetically. So that was a neat experience. I probably will do it again at some point. But in general, I've always found students, not always, but they usually, definitely enjoy OHara, Koch. Ashbery is a little harder. I think I find it, I love Ashbery and Koch so much on his work, but it's only a select group sort of, opens up to Ashbery and really gets into it. And I've also found Schuyler a little tricky to teach because I love it so much. And I spend most of my time just sort of like with my jaw hanging open and looking at it, and like, look how cool this is. But it's subtle and it's a little hard to convey why I think it's so cool. But I don't know. You'd have to ask my students. But and Bernadette Mayer, I've had a lot of success teaching Midwinter Day and Alstom, stuff like that. Students like Midwinter Day quite a bit, and I've taught that in a bunch of settings. So yeah, definitely been a mainstay of my teaching.
I found with Ashbery, lots of people find him very, very difficult and really don't get on with him, but there's always one or two people who completely fall in love with him. And they're not the people you expect. It's not always the kind of, the sort of very, very high achieving students. Often it's people who just feel something for him.
Yeah.
It's really exciting when that happens. And it happens all the time. It's, most people are like, what is going on here? And then suddenly someone's just like, I have to write about Ashbery. I have to do an MA specifically so I can continue to think about Ashbery. And there's something really kind of magical about that, I think.
Yeah, that's great. I love when that happens too.
I also find that students love either Ashbery or OHara. I have the rare love both as much as you've mentioned OHara so many times that maybe a nice ending would be to ask you what your favorite OHara poem is and why.
I can't do favorites. I'm sorry, but I will
amongst them.
I mean, literally, 40 or 50 I could name. So it's really hard and depends on the day. Maybe I'll give the sentimental answer, which is one that's particularly close to my heart, which is not my heart, although I love that poem too. And it's hanging over my desk at school, but at my office. But the poem Aller Recherche Gertrude Stein that begins whenever I'm feeling sullen, anxious, etc., which is a sentimental favorite because my wife and I read parts of that at our wedding. So
that's beautiful. What a great alternative to having a Coke with you for all our listeners out there who have heard it. It's
a beautiful poem. It's a little bit there's parts of it that are a little graphic, so we kind of edited some lines
for mom and dad
about the hair on your torso and things like that, but for the wedding. But there's really beautiful last lines about we'll be together in this life come what may, and so on. So that's a favorite, and there's dozens of others, but
that's a gorgeous option. Thank you.
Well, it is a gorgeous option. I was reading it today. I hadn't I've not come across it for ages, and I was just really struck by how beautiful it is. So and a good kind of alternative to having a Coke with you, which I think is definitely lots of people's favorites.
Very relatable, as Brian would
Brian would say. Okay, good. Well, thank you so much for chatting to us for so long.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to blab on about the New York School, and congratulations on launching the network. I'm very excited about it.
Thank you, and we'll hopefully we'll do more of these things, and hopefully hear from lots of people about their origin stories. Can't imagine that many people have quite as good an origin story as yours.
I look forward to hearing
Yeah, so thanks so much for sharing all of that.